March 27, 1977. A date that would forever change aviation history. On a foggy runway in the Canary Islands, two Boeing 747 jumbo jets collided in what remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. 583 people lost their lives in a disaster that shouldn't have happened. This wasn't a story of mechanical failure or bad weather alone. This was a perfect storm of human error, miscommunication, and a series of small decisions that cascaded into catastrophe. Our story actually begins at a different airport. Las Palmas Airport on the neighboring island of Gran Canaria was the intended destination for both aircraft involved in the collision. It was larger, better equipped, and could easily handle international jumbo jet traffic. But on that fateful Sunday afternoon, a bomb exploded in the florist shop inside the Las Palmas terminal. The blast was set off by separatist activists seeking independence for the Canary Islands. While the explosion caused damage, it was a second bomb threat that changed everything. Authorities received a warning that another device had been planted in the terminal. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to understand where it happened. The disaster didn't occur at a major international hub. It happened at Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife, a small airport nestled in the mountains, never designed to handle the massive 747s that would meet their fate there. Tenerife is part of Spain's Canary Islands, sitting off the northwest coast of Africa. In 1977, Los Rodeos was a regional airport with a single runway. It had limited taxiways, no ground radar, and was frequently shrouded in fog from the surrounding peaks. On a clear day, it was manageable. On a foggy day, it was a controller's nightmare. The airport was never meant to be the stage for history's worst aviation disaster. That distinction was forced upon it by events happening 60 miles away. Our story actually begins at a different airport. Las Palmas Airport on the neighboring island of Gran Canaria was the intended destination for both aircraft involved in the collision. It was larger, better equipped, and could easily handle international jumbo jet traffic. But on that fateful Sunday afternoon, a bomb exploded in the florist shop inside the Las Palmas terminal. The blast was set off by separatist activists seeking independence for the Canary Islands. While the explosion caused damage, it was a second bomb threat that changed everything. Authorities received a warning that another device had been planted in the terminal. Las Palmas Airport was immediately shut down. Every incoming flight was diverted. Dozens of aircraft, including our two 747s, were rerouted to the only other option in the area, the small, mountainous Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife. Within hours, the tiny airport was overwhelmed. The ramp was packed with diverted aircraft. Passengers filled every available space in the terminal. The controllers, used to handling a modest flow of inter-island traffic, were now managing some of the world's largest aircraft in conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. Let's meet the two aircraft that would collide on that foggy runway. KLM Flight 4805 was a Boeing 747-206B, registration PHBUF, named the Rhine. It was barely 3 years old, a gleaming symbol of modern aviation. The jumbo jet had departed Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport that morning, carrying 234 passengers, most of them Dutch tourists heading for a vacation in the Canary Islands. With 14 crew members aboard, there were 248 people on the KLM aircraft. The captain was Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, KLM's chief flight instructor and one of the airline's most senior and respected pilots. Van Zanten was the face of KLM safety. He appeared in the airline's advertisements. He trained other 747 pilots. With over 11,000 flight hours, including 1,500 on the 747, he was considered one of the best in the business. Pan Am Flight 1736 was a Boeing 747-121, registration in 736PA, named Clipper Victor. This aircraft had more history, having been the first 747 delivered to Pan American World Airways back in 1970. It was the third 747 ever built. That day, it was operating a charter flight from Los Angeles to Las Palmas, carrying 378 passengers and 16 crew members, for a total of 394 people on board. The Pan Am captain was Victor Grubbs, an experienced pilot with over 21,000 flight hours. His first officer was Robert Bragg, and the flight engineer was George Warnes. They were seasoned professionals running a routine charter operation. Both aircraft were diverted to Tenerife. Neither crew was happy about it. The KLM crew, in particular, had a problem. Dutch regulations limited how many hours a crew could work. Van Zanten and his crew were approaching their maximum duty time. If they didn't get back to Amsterdam within their window, they'd have to overnight in Tenerife, throwing off KLM's carefully planned schedule and costing the airline money. Time pressure was building. As the diverted aircraft poured into Los Rodeos, the airport descended into chaos. The small terminal couldn't accommodate all the passengers. The ramp didn't have enough parking positions. Aircraft were parked nose to tail along the taxiways. The single runway was the only way in and the only way out. KLM 4805 landed first. Pan Am 1736 arrived shortly after. Both aircraft parked and waited. Passengers stayed on board for some time before being allowed into the overcrowded terminal. Hours passed. The crews grew impatient, then word came, Las Palmas was reopening. Aircraft could return. The KLM passengers were called back to board. The Pan Am passengers loaded up. Both jumbo jets prepared to depart. Here's where the airport's layout created a fatal problem. Los Rodeos had one main runway and a parallel taxiway. But because so many diverted aircraft were parked along the taxiway, it was blocked. Aircraft couldn't taxi normally to the runway. Instead, they had to taxi down the runway itself, then make a 180-degree turn to line up for takeoff. The Pan Am 747 was instructed to taxi down the runway and turn off at the third intersection, called Taxiway Charlie 3, to clear the runway for KLM's departure. The KLM 747 would taxi behind Pan Am, continue to the end of the runway, turn around, and wait for clearance to take off. It sounds straightforward. It wasn't. As if the situation wasn't complicated enough, weather became a factor. Fog from the surrounding mountains began to roll across the airport. Visibility dropped rapidly. Within minutes, the fog was so thick that the tower controllers couldn't see the runway. They couldn't see where the aircraft were. They were controlling traffic blind. Remember, this was 1977. Los Rodeos didn't have ground radar. The controllers had no electronic way to track where aircraft were positioned. They relied entirely on pilot reports and their own eyes. With visibility near zero, they were operating on faith and radio communication alone. Both 747s entered the runway. KLM taxied behind Pan Am through the fog. The two massive aircraft were on the same piece of pavement, separated by distance and obscured by clouds of mist. What happened next is a textbook case of how small communication errors can compound into disaster. The radio frequencies were congested. Multiple transmissions overlapped. Key words were misheard or misunderstood. The crew resource management concepts we take for granted today didn't exist. Captains were authority figures whose decisions were rarely questioned. Pan Am was taxiing down the runway, looking for the Charlie 3 turnoff. But visibility was terrible. They missed Charlie 3. The crew discussed whether they'd passed it. There was confusion. They continued taxiing, looking for the next available exit. Meanwhile, KLM reached the end of the runway and turned around. Captain Van Zanten was thinking about his duty time. He was thinking about getting home. He was thinking about his passengers and the airline's schedule. The pressure was enormous. Van Zanten advanced the throttles. The KLM 747 began to roll. From the tower, the controller called, KLM 4805, you are cleared to the Papa beacon, climb to and maintain flight level 90. Right turn after takeoff, proceed with heading 040 until intercepting the 325 radial from Las Palmas VOR. This was a route clearance, not a takeoff clearance. But in the tension and noise, it may have sounded like permission to go. The KLM flight engineer read back the clearance. Then he added, we are now at takeoff. The controller responded, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But the transmission was stepped on. At the exact same moment, Pan Am radioed, "No, we're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736." The two transmissions overlapped. The KLM crew heard only a squeal of interference. They didn't hear Pan Am's critical message. They didn't know Pan Am was still on the runway. In the cockpit, the KLM first officer expressed doubt. He asked the captain, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" Van Zanten replied, "Oh, yes." It was a fatal assumption. The KLM 747, weighing hundreds of tons and loaded with fuel, accelerated down the runway. In the fog, Captain Van Zanten couldn't see more than a few hundred feet ahead. He was flying blind, trusting that the runway was clear. In the Pan Am cockpit, Captain Grubbs and his crew were still looking for their turnoff when they saw lights emerging from the fog. The KLM jumbo jet was barreling toward them at over 150 miles per hour. "There he is," someone shouted. "Look at him. That son of a bitch is coming." Grubbs shoved the throttles forward and yanked the steering tiller hard left, trying desperately to get off the runway. The Pan Am 747 lurched toward the grass. Van Zanten saw the Pan Am jet at the last second. He pulled back on the control column, trying to lift off early, trying to clear the obstacle. The KLM 747's nose pitched up. The tail skidded down the runway in a shower of sparks. For one impossible moment, it looked like Van Zanten might make it. The KLM aircraft lifted off the ground. But it was too heavy, too slow, too low. The landing gear and lower fuselage of the KLM 747 slammed into the top of the Pan Am fuselage. The impact was catastrophic. The KLM aircraft tore through the Pan Am cabin like a saw blade. Metal shrieked. Fuel ignited. The KLM 747 staggered into the air for a few seconds, then crashed back down 500 feet further along the runway and exploded into a massive fireball. The Pan Am 747 was gutted. Fire erupted through the cabin. Sections of the aircraft were torn away. Yet somehow, the nose section and cockpit remained relatively intact. Everyone aboard the KLM flight perished instantly. All 248 souls, including Captain Van Zanten, were killed in the fireball. On the Pan Am aircraft, the situation was desperate but not hopeless. The cockpit crew survived the initial impact. Some passengers in the forward sections also lived through the collision. As flames spread through the cabin, survivors scrambled to escape. Flight attendants and passengers worked together to open emergency exits. Some jumped from the intact nose section. Others crawled through holes torn in the fuselage. First Officer Bragg, despite serious injuries, helped evacuate passengers before escaping himself. Captain Grubbs and Flight Engineer Warrens also survived. In total, 61 people from the Pan Am flight survived the initial impact. However, 9 later died from injuries, bringing the Pan Am death toll to 335. The final count: 583 dead, making it the deadliest accident in aviation history. The investigation into the Tenerife disaster was exhaustive and painful. Cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders were recovered and analyzed. Radio transmissions were examined. Survivors were interviewed. Every second of the tragedy was reconstructed. The findings were damning but also revelatory. This wasn't a simple case of pilot error. This was a cascade of systemic failures. Contributing factors included the bomb threat that diverted all traffic to an inadequate airport, the congested ramp that forced aircraft to taxi on the runway, the fog that eliminated visual references, the lack of ground radar, the congested radio frequency that caused critical transmissions to be blocked, the culture of deference that prevented the first officer from more forcefully challenging the captain, the time pressure that influenced decision-making. But at the core was a miscommunication. Van Zanten believed he had clearance to take off. The tower believed KLM was holding in position. Pan Am was caught in the middle of the phrase, "We are now at takeoff," became infamous. In English aviation phraseology, this was ambiguous. Did it mean we are currently taking off or we are now at the takeoff position? The phrase was non-standard and unclear. Standard phraseology exists for exactly this reason. Clarity saves lives. The Tenerife disaster didn't just claim lives. It changed aviation forever. The lessons learned from that foggy runway led to fundamental reforms in how we fly. Crew resource management, CRM, became mandatory. No longer would captains be unquestionable gods of the cockpit. Crews were trained to communicate openly, to question decisions, to work as a team. Junior crew members were empowered to speak up. The first officer's hesitant question to Van Zanten became a teaching moment. Doubt should be voiced loudly and clearly. Standard phraseology was reinforced and expanded. Phrases like takeoff are now only used when an aircraft is actually departing. Controllers say cleared for takeoff. Pilots say taking off. Ambiguity was eliminated. Ground radar systems became standard equipment at major airports. Controllers could now see where aircraft were positioned, even in zero visibility. Cockpit procedures were revised. Checklists were refined. Sterile cockpit rules, which prohibit non-essential conversation during critical phases of flight, were strengthened. The industry learned that accidents rarely have a single cause. They result from chains of events, each link creating conditions for the next failure. Break any link in that chain, and the accident might be prevented. Tenerife broke the chain for future generations. Beyond the technical findings, Tenerife reminds us of the human element in aviation. Captain Van Zanten wasn't a reckless cowboy. He was a skilled, respected professional who made a decision under pressure. The KLM first officer wasn't incompetent, he was operating in a culture where questioning the captain was difficult. The Pan Am crew did everything they could. They tried to clarify their position. They tried to get off the runway. They fought to save their passengers after impact. The controllers at Los Rodeos were overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. They were managing a crisis situation with inadequate tools. Everyone involved was doing their best in an impossible situation. That's what makes this disaster so tragic and so instructive. Good people, following procedures as they understood them, still created catastrophe. It's a reminder that safety isn't about blame. It's about learning, improving, and ensuring it never happens again. The Tenerife Airport disaster stands as the deadliest accident in aviation history. 583 people died on a foggy runway in the Canary Islands because of a perfect storm of bad luck, poor communication, and cascading failures. But from that tragedy came progress. Aviation became safer. Communication became clearer. Crews became teams. The industry honored the victims by learning from their deaths and implementing changes that have saved countless lives in the decades since. Today, when you board a flight, you benefit from the lessons of Tenerife. The standardized phraseology, the crew resource management training, the ground radar systems, the safety culture that encourages speaking up, all of these exist, in part, because of what happened on March 27, 1977. The names of the 583 victims are remembered. Their legacy is the sky we fly through today, made safer by the painful lessons learned on that tragic day in Tenerife.